I never imagined my own son would try to steal my life from under me. The morning I discovered Derek had filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, I was deadheading my prized chrysanthemums in the front garden. 76 years of living, 5 years of widowhood, and a lifetime of memories suddenly meant nothing to him. She's showing signs of cognitive decline, his lawyer's letter stated, as if discussing a broken appliance. He wanted control of my house, my savings, my very existence. But what kind of mother would I be if I didn't teach my ungrateful son a lesson about underestimating his elders? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though at my age, beginnings and endings blur together like watercolors in the rain. My name is Oli Katmej, and I've lived in this same house in Salem, Oregon for 43 years. Henry and I bought it when Derek was just 5, back when the neighborhood was filled with young families and the American dream still felt achievable. On a librarian's and professor's salary, the house sits on Maple Street, a quiet residential road lined with century-old oak trees that Henry used to say were older than our troubles and wiser than our worries. It's a modest craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch, painted sage green with white trim that I refresh every 3 years like clockwork. The front garden bursts with flowers from March through October, daffodils giving way to tulips. Then roses, followed by my beloved chrysanthemums that bloom until the first frost. People often stop to admire the garden, and I take pride in knowing that at 76, my hands might shake when I'm tired, but they still know how to coax beauty from soil. Inside, the house tells the story of a well-lived life. Henry's leather reading chair still sits by the bay window in the living room, worn smooth from decades of his evening ritual with whatever book had caught his fancy. I haven't moved it, though he's been gone 5 years now. Sometimes I sit there myself, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave that somehow still clings to the leather, reading the mystery novels he would have dismissed as frivolous entertainment. Turns out frivolous entertainment suits me just fine these days. The kitchen, with its butcher block counters and vintage yellow appliances, remains the heart of the home. This is where I spend most mornings, baking bread or trying new recipes I find online. Yes, online. Derek would be surprised to learn that his declining mother navigates the internet just fine. Thank you very much. I've been writing short stories for a small literary magazine, submitting them via email like any other modern person. The magazine doesn't pay much, but seeing my byline in print still gives me the same thrill it did when I was 25 and dreaming of becoming the next Flannery O'Connor. My bedroom upstairs overlooks the backyard, where I grow heirloom tomatoes. In raised beds Henry built the summer before his heart attack. Cherokee purples, brandywines, and green zebras sprawl across wooden trellises he crafted with his own hands. Each August, I can enough tomato sauce to last through winter, the same way my mother taught me 60 years ago. Derek used to love helping with the canning when he was little, standing on a step stool beside me, his small hands carefully wiping down the mason jars. Where did that little boy go? Derek lives in Portland now, about an hour's drive away, though. You'd think it was across the country given how rarely he visits. He's built quite a successful real estate development business, or so he tells me during our monthly phone calls that feel more like status reports than conversations between mother and son. The housing market is booming, Mom, he'll say, his voice carrying that particular strain of someone juggling too many deals. Prices just keep climbing. Your place would probably fetch twice what you paid for it. I should have paid attention to those comments. Derek married young to a woman named Sandra who seemed pleasant enough, though they divorced when their daughter Lily was 12. Now Lily is 22 and lives somewhere in Seattle, working for a tech company whose name changes every time Derek mentions it. She sends me birthday cards and occasionally calls, but I can hear in her voice the same distance that's crept into Derek's. It's as if our family has slowly drifted apart like boats on a calm lake, each of us floating in our own direction without anchor or destination. The irony isn't lost on me that my closest family relationship these days is with them. My brother's granddaughter, who moved in with me 3 months ago after her startup in San Francisco collapsed. At 26, Em possesses the kind of restless energy that used to characterize Derek, but tempered with the warmth and curiosity he seems to have lost. She's been sleeping in what used to be Henry's study. Surrounded by towers of moving boxes, she keeps promising to unpack next weekend. Em works remotely for some marketing firm, her laptop perpetually open on the kitchen table, fingers flying across keys as she manages social media campaigns for clients I've never heard of. She speaks in acronyms SEO, CTA, UGC that sound like secret codes, but she has infinite patience for my questions about this digital world that feels both fascinating and foreign. And Oli, she say, looking up from her screen with eyes the same brown as my brother's were, you'd be amazed what goes viral these days. Sometimes it's just someone's grandma making cookies, and suddenly she has 1 million followers. I find this notion both absurd and oddly comforting. In a world that seems to value youth above all else, perhaps there's still room for the wisdom that comes with having lived long enough to see the patterns repeat. My daily routine has settled into a comfortable rhythm over the years since Henry's death. I wake at 6, make coffee in the French press he brought back from a conference in Montreal, and sit on the front porch with the newspaper. Yes, the actual paper version that gets delivered to my door. I like the weight of it in my hands, though the ink smudges slightly on my fingers. After breakfast, I tend the garden, deadheading spent blooms and checking for pests with the vigilance of a general inspecting troops. Afternoons are for writing. I've converted the small room off the kitchen into my office, with Henry's old desk and a computer Em helped me buy last year. The walls are lined with books, mostly mysteries and literary fiction, but also gardening guides and cookbooks with pages stained from decades of use. I write for 2 hours without interruption, working on stories about women like me who refuse to become invisible just because society says they should. Evenings bring visits from my neighbour Jasper, a retired botanist whose wife died 2 years ago. We share tea and conversation about our gardens, sometimes venturing into deeper topics like the books we're reading or memories of our spouses. Jasper has kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of listening that makes even mundane observations feel significant. Neither of us has mentioned that these visits have become the highlight of our respective days, but I suspect we both know it. This was my life: predictable, peaceful, purposeful. I paid my bills on time, maintained my house, contributed to my community through volunteer work at the library. My doctor pronounced me healthy at my last checkup, aside from the arthritis that makes my hands shake when I'm tired and the reading glasses I now need for small print. My mind remained sharp. I could still beat Em at Scrabble and remember details from books I'd read decades ago. I was content. More than content, I was thriving in the quiet way that comes with having survived loss and found equilibrium again. I had my garden, my writing, my memories of Henry, and the simple pleasure of each new day unfolding at my own pace. I should have known it was too good to last. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late September, though I wouldn't recognize it as trouble for several more days. Derek called during my usual coffee time on the porch, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of forced cheer. "Hi, Mom, how are you feeling?" The question struck me as odd. Derek typically opened our conversations with updates about his business or complaints about Portland traffic. "I'm fine, dear, just enjoying my coffee and watching Mrs. Henderson's cat stalk something in her garden." "That's good. Really good. Mom, I've been thinking, when was the last time you had a thorough checkup?" "I mean, really thorough, maybe with a specialist." I set my coffee cup down, the pleasant morning suddenly feeling less bright. "I see Dr. Peterson every 6 months. Derek, he says I'm healthier than most people my age." "Right, but Dr. Peterson is just a general practitioner. I'm talking about someone who specializes in cognitive health." For seniors, the word seniors hung in the air like a small insult. "My cognition is just fine, thank you. Yesterday, I balanced my checkbook, updated my password for online banking, and wrote a story about a woman who discovers her neighbor has been stealing her mail. Would you like to read it, Mom? I'm just concerned. You're living alone in that big house, managing everything by yourself. What if something happened? Then I'd handle it the same way I've been handling things for 5 years since your father died. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear traffic noise in the background. Derek was probably calling from his car between appointments, squeezing me into his schedule like another item on his to-do list. Look, I know you think you're managing fine, but maybe it's time to consider alternatives, more social opportunities. Less isolation. There are some really nice communities in Portland where you could have your own apartment but also access to activities, meals, healthcare. You mean a nursing home? They're not called that anymore, Mom. These are luxury senior living communities. Independent living with support when you need it. I don't need support, Derek. I need my garden. And my house and my life exactly as it is. Another pause. We'll talk more about this soon, okay? I love you, Mom. After he hung up, I sat on the porch for another hour, watching the autumn light shift through the oak leaves. Something about the conversation felt rehearsed, as if Derek had been practicing his lines, but I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to the natural worrying adult children feel about aging parents. Lord knows I'd had similar conversations with my own mother before she died. It wasn't until the following week that the real trouble announced itself, arriving in my mailbox with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The envelope was official looking, with the return address of Multnomah County Circuit Court. My hand shook slightly as I opened it, not from age or infirmity, but from the cold dread that starts in your stomach and spreads outward like spilled ice water. Petition for appointment of guardian for allegedly incapacitated person. The words swam before my eyes as I read Derek's formal request to have me declared mentally incompetent. According to the petition, I was showing signs of cognitive decline, living in unsafe conditions, and unable to manage personal and financial affairs. The document painted a picture of a confused old woman wandering around a deteriorating house, lost in memories and incapable of rational decision-making. It wasn't just the lies that staggered me, it was the calculated cruelty of them. Derek had clearly been building his case for months, noting every time I'd repeated a story during our phone calls, every occasion I'd asked him to speak up because his voice wasn't clear through the phone. He twisted normal signs of aging into evidence of incompetence, reframing my contentment with solitude as dangerous isolation. The petition requested that Derek be appointed as my guardian, giving him control over my finances, healthcare decisions, and living arrangements. In other words, he wanted legal permission to sell my house, move me into one of those luxury communities, and manage my money as he saw fit. I read the document 3 times, my hands growing steadier with each reading as shock gave way to fury. Then I walked to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down to think. 60 years of marriage had taught me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. Derek had just revealed himself to be the kind of man who would betray his own mother for financial gain, who would use the legal system to steal what he couldn't inherit fast enough to suit his needs. But if Derek thought his old mother would go quietly into that good night, he had seriously underestimated the woman who'd raised him. I picked up the phone and called M. Arrived within an hour of my call, her Honda Civic screeching into my driveway like she was fleeing a crime scene. She burst through the front door without knocking, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder and her dark hair pulled back in the kind of messy bun that somehow looked intentional on someone her age. And Ollie, what the hell? She dropped her bag and reached for the court documents I'd left on the kitchen table. I mean, what the actual hell? I watched her read, noting how her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to the kind of righteous anger that reminded me why I'd always liked this particular niece. Em had inherited the family tendency toward fierce loyalty, but unlike Derek, she'd apparently retained her moral compass. "This is insane," she said, looking up from the papers. "You're literally the most competent person I know. You balance your checkbook by hand, you remember everyone's birthday, you can recite poetry from memory. You just learned how to use Venmo last month. Thank you, dear, though I'm not sure my Venmo skills will impress the judge." Em started pacing around the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. "This is about money, isn't it? Uncle Derek wants to get his hands on your house. I suspect so. Though he seems to think I'm too adult to notice. God, what?" A piece of lamb caught herself and looked apologetic. "Sorry, I know he's your son. At the moment, I'm not entirely sure he is. Em stopped pacing and stared at me. What do you mean? I don't recognize this person in these legal papers. The Derek I raised would never do something like this. Either he's changed completely, or I never knew him as well as I thought I did. The truth of this statement hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent the past few hours cycling through emotions, shock, anger, hurt, but this was worse. This was the hollow realization that the child I'd loved and nurtured and worried over for 48 years had become a stranger capable of breathtaking cruelty. Em sat down across from me, her young face serious. So, what are you going to do? Fight him? How? I gestured toward the court documents. I have 30 days to respond to this petition. I'll need a lawyer, obviously. Someone who specializes in elder law and can demonstrate that I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. That's good. That's a start. But Uncle Derek has been planning this for a while, right? He's got documentation, probably witnesses. You need more than just a legal defense. Em was right, though I wasn't sure what she was suggesting. What did you have in mind? I'm thinking about public opinion. Social media, the court of public perception. I must have looked blank because Em pulled out her phone and started scrolling. And Ollie, do you have any idea how many people hate stories like this? Adult children taking advantage of their elderly parents. It's like catnip for social media outrage. I'm not sure I want to become internet fodder, dear, but that's just it. You wouldn't be fodder, you'd be fighting back. Controlling the narrative instead of letting Uncle Derek write it for you. Em leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that reminded me of Derek when he was young and still dreamed of changing the world instead of profiting from it. Think about it. He's counting on you being embarrassed, keeping this quiet, fighting it through proper legal channels while he spins the story his way. But what if you didn't do that? What if you got ahead of it? I'm not sure I understand. Em pulled up something on her phone and turned the screen toward me. See this. It's a Twitter thread from last month about a woman in Texas whose son tried to have her committed so he could sell her house. She fought back by posting the whole story online, and it went viral. The public pressure was so intense that the son dropped the case and publicly apologized. I studied the phone screen, squinting at the small text. And you think I should do something similar? Not exactly. That woman used her real name, posted photos, made herself completely public. You don't have to do that. We could create an anonymous account, tell your story without revealing who you are or where you live. Let people draw their own conclusions about what kind of son files a competency petition against his healthy mother. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. I'd lived my entire life believing in proper channels, in handling problems with dignity and discretion. But proper channels had got me a court summons and a son who wanted to steal my life. How would it work? Em grinned, and I caught a glimpse of the mischievous child she'd once been. Leave that to me. I've been running social media campaigns for 3 years. I know exactly how to make something go viral. Before I could ask what going viral actually meant, my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a man in a suit standing on my porch with a clipboard. Em followed my gaze and frowned. Process. Server, she said. Probably more court documents. I opened the door to find a young man who looked apologetic about his mission. Mrs. Catmedge, I have a summons for you. He handed me another official envelope and asked me to sign for it. After he left, I opened it to find a notice that Derek had also filed for an emergency hearing, claiming I posed an immediate danger. To myself, the hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, less than a week away. Em read over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. He's not messing around. An emergency hearing means he's telling the court you're in immediate crisis. What kind of crisis? According to this, you're living in unsafe and unsanitary conditions and showing signs of severe cognitive impairment that put you at risk of harm. I looked around my immaculate kitchen, at the fresh flowers on the table and the clean dishes drying in the rack. Well, he's certainly committed to his fiction. And Ollie, this is serious. Emergency hearings have a lower burden of proof. If Uncle Derek has any documentation at all, doctor's notes, photos, witness statements, he could get temporary guardianship approved. Once that happens, you'd have to fight from a much weaker position. The full scope of Derek's betrayal was beginning to dawn on me. This wasn't just about money, it was about erasing me entirely. If he succeeded in getting guardianship, I would become a legal nonentity, unable to make decisions about my own life, my own body, my own future. I said slowly, I think I'd like to learn more about this social media idea. Her grin widened. Now you're talking. We spent the next 2 hours at my kitchen table while explained the basics of Twitter, Instagram, and something called TikTok that apparently involve short videos. She showed me examples of viral stories, explained how hashtags worked, and demonstrated the terrifying speed with which information could spread across the internet. The key is authenticity, she said, pulling up examples on her laptop. People can smell fake outrage from a mile away, but a real story, told with genuine emotion. That's rocket fuel for social media. And you think my story would qualify? And Oli, your story is perfect. It hits every nerve: family betrayal, elder abuse, David versus Goliath. Plus, you're naturally funny and sharp as hell. People are going to love you. The phrase elder abuse stopped me cold. I'd been thinking of Derek's actions as betrayal, as greed, as cruelty. But Em was right, this was abuse. My own son was abusing me, using the legal system as his weapon. What would I have to do? Just be yourself, tell your story in your own words. I'll handle all the technical stuff: creating accounts, posting content, managing engagement. We'll start small, see how it goes. If it doesn't work, we can always stop. I thought about Derek sitting in his Portland office, probably congratulating himself on his clever legal strategy. He'd counted on my dignity, my desire for privacy, my reluctance to air family business in public. He'd assumed I would fight him quietly, through proper channels, while he controlled the narrative. All right, I said. Let's give it a try. Em's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Really, really. But I have one condition. What's that? If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. I want to tell the whole truth, not just the parts that make me look good. And I want people to understand that this isn't just about one greedy son, it's about how our society treats older people, how we dismiss their autonomy and assume they're incompetent just because they've lived long enough to need reading glasses. Em nodded solemnly. I can work with that. Actually, that's even better. It makes it about more than just your personal situation. Good, because if I'm going to become internet famous, I might as well have something worthwhile to say. Laughed. But I was completely serious. If Derek wanted to use the legal system to silence me, I was going to use the internet to find my voice. And if that voice happened to make him the laughingstock of social media in the process, well, that would just be a pleasant bonus. We started that very evening, with him setting up accounts, while I worked on what she called content strategy. It felt strange, planning to share my most private family crisis with strangers on the internet. But it also felt like taking back control, like refusing to be a victim of my son's ambition. Derek had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that his 76-year-old mother would go quietly, that she'd be too embarrassed or confused or frightened to fight back effectively. He'd forgotten that the woman who raised him had spent 40 years as a librarian, dealing with difficult patrons, managing complex systems, and finding creative solutions to impossible problems. He'd forgotten that I'd survived the loss of my husband, rebuilt my life from scratch, and learned to thrive in solitude. Most importantly, he'd forgotten that librarians are natural researchers. And I was about to research the hell out of how to destroy someone's reputation on social media. As evening fell, Em and I continued our planning session over leftover soup and the kind of determination that comes from righteous anger. She showed me how Twitter worked, explaining the difference between tweets and threads, demonstrating how to use hashtags and tag other users. The beauty of anonymity, she said, typing on her laptop, is that it lets people focus on your story, instead of getting distracted by who you are. Plus, it protects you legally. Uncle Derek can't claim you're harassing him if he doesn't know it's you. What kind of name should we use? Em grinned. I've been thinking about that. Something that hints at your age and situation without being obvious. How about ... Granna Revenge 76? I considered this. Rather on the nose, isn't it? Sometimes on the nose works. It's memorable, searchable, And it tells people exactly what they're getting into. Within an hour, Grana Revenge 76 had been born. M created the account with a profile photo of a generic elderly woman's hands holding knitting needles, a deliberate misdirection, since I'd never knitted a day in my life, and a bio that read, 76 years old. Mind sharp as ever, some thinks. Otherwise, let's see about that. Your first tweet should introduce the situation without giving too much away, M advised. Think of it as a teaser trailer. I dictated while she typed. My son just filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent so he can control my finances and sell my house. I bake bread from scratch, balance my checkbook by hand, and remember every birthday in the family. But apparently, I'm too cognitively impaired to manage my own life. Thread incoming, perfect, M said, adding hashtags like hashtag elder abuse, hashtag family betrayal, hashtag competency hearing. Now we need to tell the whole story, but in bite-sized pieces that people can easily share. We worked for another 2 hours, crafting a thread that laid out the basic facts of Derek's petition, the emergency hearing, and the broader implications for how society treats older adults. N helped me strike the right tone, serious enough to convey the gravity of the situation, but with enough dry humor to make it engaging rather than just depressing. The final thread was 12 tweets long, each building on the last to create a complete picture of what M called institutional ageism masquerading as family concern. I was particularly proud of tweet number 8, apparently asking my son to speak up during phone calls because he mumbles is evidence of hearing loss that proves cognitive decline. By that logic, everyone who's ever said what in a crowded restaurant should be institutionalized, ready to post. M asked, her finger hovering over the publish button. I took a deep breath. Once this went online, there would be no taking it back. I'd be inviting strangers into my most painful family crisis, trusting the internet to be more fair than my own son had been. Do it. M clicked. And just like that, my story was out in the world. The response to our first Twitter thread was unlike anything I could have imagined. Within hours, Grana Revenge 76 had hundreds of followers and dozens of replies from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and elder abuse. M monitored the account throughout the evening, reading me the most supportive comments while filtering out what she diplomatically called the trolls. Look at this one, she said, showing me her phone, a woman in Michigan whose daughter tried to have her committed after she remarried at 72. And this one, a man whose son took his car keys and reported him to Adult Protective Services for refusing to move into assisted living. I found these stories both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because I wasn't alone in this experience. Horrifying because it suggested Derek's behavior was part of a much larger pattern of adult children using legal systems to control their aging parents. How many people have seen it so far? I asked. M checked her laptop. The original thread has been viewed about 8,000 times and retweeted over 300 times. For a brand new account, that's incredible engagement. The numbers meant little to me, but M's excitement was infectious. For the first time since receiving Derek's petition, I felt like I was doing something instead of just reacting to his actions. Wednesday morning brought the first complication. I was in the garden, staking my late-season tomatoes, when Derek's car pulled into my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see M frantically closing her laptop and shoving it into her bag. Derek climbed out of his silver BMW looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and expensive shoes. But there was something different about his posture, a tension I hadn't noticed during his previous visits. He walked up the front path with the measured steps of someone approaching an unpleasant task. "Hi, Mom," he said when I opened the door. "I thought we should talk. Come in." Then, he glanced around the living room as if cataloguing evidence for his case. I wondered if he was noting the slight coffee ring on Henry's reading table or the stack of library books that suggested I was still capable of reading and returning materials on time. "M," he said, nodding toward my niece with cool politeness. "I didn't know you were still staying here." "Just helping out," M replied, her voice carefully neutral. Derek sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped together. "Mom, I assume You've received the court documents by now. I have indeed. I want you to know this wasn't an easy decision. I've been worried about you for months. I studied my son's face, looking for some sign of the child I'd raised. What exactly have you been worried about, Derek? Well, you're living alone in this big house. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? And some of our conversations have been concerning. Concerning how you've been repeating stories. Asking me to clarify things you should remember. Last month, you forgot we talked about Lily's job change. I remembered that conversation perfectly. Derek had mentioned something about Lily working for a new company, but when I'd asked for details, he'd been vague and distracted. I asked you to elaborate because you were being unclear, not because I'd forgotten. Mom, I know this is hard to accept, but these are early signs of cognitive decline. The sooner we address it, the better we can manage your care. The word manage hung in the air like a threat. And by manage, you mean taking control of my finances and moving me into an institution. It's not an institution. These senior communities offer independence with support when you need it. Em cleared her throat. Uncle Derek, have you actually visited any of these places? He turned toward her with obvious irritation. This is a family matter, Em. I'm family too, and I live here. I see an Ollie every day, and she's completely competent. She manages her own medications, pays her bills on time, maintains this house. Better than most people half her age. You're 26 years old. You don't have the experience to recognize the signs of dementia, and you're a real estate developer, not a doctor. What makes you qualified to diagnose anyone? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Derek's jaw tightened, and I recognized the expression from his childhood, the look he got when he was losing an argument but couldn't admit it. I've consulted with professionals, he said stiffly. What professionals? I asked. Dr. Patterson mentioned some concerns during your last visit. This was news to me. Dr. Patterson said I was in excellent health for my age. He specifically complimented my memory when I recited my complete medical history without looking at my notes. He also noted the tremor in your hands and suggested you might benefit from additional support. Arthritis isn't dementia, Derek. It's not just the arthritis, Mom. It's the combination of factors. The isolation, the repetitive conversations, the difficulty with new technology. I learned to use email, online banking, and video calls during the pandemic. I interrupted. I submit my stories to magazines electronically and maintain correspondence with editors. Em can attest to my technology skills. Em nodded vigorously. She's better with computers than half my friends. Derek stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Look, I know you both think I'm the villain here, but I'm trying to protect you. Mom, what happens when you can't live independently anymore? What happens when you need help and there's no one around to provide it? Then I'll ask for help. The same way any rational adult would. By then it might be too late. You might not recognize that you need help. The circular logic of his argument was maddening. He was essentially saying that because I currently didn't think I needed help, I must be too impaired to recognize my own impairment. It was the kind of catch-22 that made competency hearings so dangerous for elderly people. Derek, I said carefully, are you having financial problems? The question hit its mark. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his professional composure slipping. What kind of question is that? A reasonable one, given the timing of your sudden concern for my welfare. You haven't visited in 4 months, but now you're worried enough to file legal papers. It makes me wonder what's changed in your life. Not mine. My business is fine. Mom, this isn't about money, but something in his voice suggested otherwise. Em and I exchanged glances, and I made a mental note to do some research into Derek's financial situation. After he left claiming he had appointments, but promising to continue this conversation soon, Em and I returned to our social media strategy with renewed purpose. He's definitely hiding something, Em said, pulling up Derek's business website on her laptop. His company develops luxury condos, right? That's a capital-intensive business. What if he's overextended? How would we find out? Public records. Mostly, business filings, property records, maybe some industry publications. I can do some digging. While M researched, I focused on our next Twitter thread. The visit with Derek had given me material for what M called character development, showing our audience who we were dealing with. I want to be careful not to make this too personal, I said. The goal is to expose the system that allows this kind of abuse, not just to humiliate Derek. Why not both? M asked, then quickly added, just kidding. You're right. It's more powerful if you take the high road. Our second thread went live that evening, focusing on the tactics adult children use to build competency cases against their parents. I detailed Derek's reframing of normal aging signs as evidence of cognitive decline, his use of doctors' comments taken out of context, and his assumption that living alone automatically meant living dangerously. The response was even stronger than our first thread. Granarevenge76 gained over 1,000 new followers in one day, and the original thread was shared by several accounts with large followings. Someone had created a hashtag Granny Revenge that other people began using to share their own stories. More importantly, we caught the attention of a journalist named Sarah Martinez who wrote about elder rights for a national magazine. She sent a direct message asking if Granarevenge76 would be willing to be interviewed for an article about elder abuse disguised as family concern. This is exactly what we want, M said excitedly. Mainstream media coverage would give us a much bigger platform. I agreed to the interview, conducted anonymously over encrypted messaging. Sarah's questions were insightful and well-informed, suggesting she'd done her homework about the legal and social issues surrounding competency hearings. One thing that strikes me about your story, she wrote, is how your son's actions reflect broader societal assumptions about aging. Can you elaborate on that? I spent considerable time crafting my response. Our culture has bought into the myth that aging inevitably means decline physical, mental, social. We assume that anyone over 70 must be lonely, confused, and in need of management rather than support. This ageism becomes a weapon in the hands of family members who want to justify taking control of someone else's life and assets. My son didn't need to prove I was incompetent. He just needed to suggest that a 76-year-old woman living alone must be incompetent by definition. Thursday brought news that the emergency hearing had been moved up to Friday afternoon. Derek's lawyer had apparently argued that my deteriorating condition warranted immediate intervention. What does that mean for us? I asked M. It means we need to accelerate our timeline. If Uncle Derek gets temporary guardianship tomorrow, it becomes much harder to fight. But it also means we have about 18 hours to generate enough public attention to make the judge think twice. M had been working contacts in the social media world, reaching out to accounts that specialized in viral content and social justice issues. Several had agreed to share our story, timing their post for maximum impact. There's something else, she said, looking up from her laptop. I found some interesting information about Uncle Derek's business. She showed me public records indicating that Derek's company had taken out several large loans in recent months, using properties as collateral. Construction permits suggested he was developing a luxury condo complex that was significantly over budget and behind schedule. He's not broke, M said, but he's definitely cash poor. This project is bleeding money, and if it fails, he could lose everything. The pieces of Derek's motivation were falling into place. He needed liquid assets to save his business, and my house represented exactly that, a valuable property he could sell quickly once he gained control of my finances. The truly sad part, I told him, is that if he'd simply asked for help, I might have considered it. Henry and I saved for 40 years, and we never had grandchildren to spoil. If Derek was in real financial trouble, we could have worked something out. But that would require admitting he needed help and treating you as an equal partner in the decision. This way, he gets the money and maintains the illusion that he's the responsible adult taking care of his declining mother. That evening, we prepared our most comprehensive thread yet, a detailed timeline of Derek's actions, supported by documentation and framed within the broader context of financial elder abuse. M had taught me to screenshot relevant portions of the court documents, carefully redacting any identifying information. This is our Hail Mary, she said. Everything we've built up to this point leads to tomorrow's hearing. If people are paying attention, if they care enough to share and comment and make noise, maybe it creates enough pressure to influence the outcome. I understood that we were essentially gambling my future on the attention span of strangers on the internet. It wasn't the most dignified approach to fighting for my independence, but dignity hadn't gotten me very far with Derek's lawyers. I said as we prepared to post, regardless of what happens tomorrow, I want you to know how grateful I am for your help with this. Are you kidding? This is the most important thing I've ever worked on. Besides, you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who might face this situation in the future. She was right. Granarevenge 76 had become bigger than my personal battle with Derek. It was a symbol of resistance against a system that routinely discounted the autonomy and dignity of older adults. As we hit post on our final pre-hearing thread, I felt a strange mix of peace and anticipation, win or lose. I was going into that courtroom tomorrow knowing I'd fought back with every tool at my disposal. Derek had underestimated his mother's capacity for strategic thinking. Tomorrow, we'd find out if he'd also underestimated the power of social media to influence real-world outcomes. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of October weather that makes you grateful for warm houses and hot coffee. I dressed carefully for court in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Henry's funeral, and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. If I was going to fight for my autonomy, I wanted to look like someone worth fighting for. Had been up since 5, monitoring social media and coordinating with the various accounts that had agreed to amplify our story. The final Granarevenge 76 thread had exploded overnight, generating thousands of shares and comments from people expressing outrage at Derek's actions. Look at this, said, showing me her laptop screen. A geriatrician in Boston shared your thread with her 50,000 followers. A legal aid organization in California is using your case to illustrate problems with competency laws, and someone started a change. Org petition demanding reform of guardianship proceedings. The numbers were impressive, but I was more interested in the individual comments from people sharing their own experiences. A woman in Florida whose brother had gained guardianship over their mother and immediately sold her house. A man in Texas whose daughter had moved him into a care facility against his will and was systematically emptying his bank accounts. Story after story of families torn apart by greed disguised as concern. Do you think it will make any difference in court? I asked. Hard to say. Judges aren't supposed to be influenced by public opinion, but they're human beings. If nothing else, it creates accountability. Judge Reyes will know that whatever she decides today will be scrutinized by thousands of people. My lawyer, Patricia Chong, arrived at 9 to prepare for the hearing. I'd hired her based on a recommendation from the Senior Legal Aid Society, and she specialized in elder law and guardianship cases. Patricia was in her 50s, with steel grey hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanour that suggested she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. I've reviewed Derek's petition and supporting documents, she said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. His case is surprisingly weak on medical evidence. No formal cognitive evaluation, no documented incidents of dangerous behaviour, mostly just speculation about what might happen. That's encouraging, it should be, but emergency hearings have a lower standard of proof. Derek's lawyers will argue that waiting for a full evaluation puts you at risk, so the court should err on the side of caution. Looked up from her laptop. What about the fact that he stands to benefit financially if he gets guardianship? That's a good point, and I'll definitely raise it. Courts are supposed to consider whether the petitioner has any conflicts of interest. Patricia walked me through the likely sequence of events at the hearing. Derek's lawyer would present their case first, probably calling Derek himself as a witness and possibly including testimony from someone who could speak to my declining condition. I would then have the opportunity to respond, with Patricia questioning me about my daily activities, decision-making capacity, and ability to live independently. The key is to stay calm and demonstrate that you're exactly what you claim to be, a mentally competent adult who's capable of managing her own affairs, Patricia said. Don't let Derek's lawyer bait you into becoming emotional or defensive. What if they ask about my social media activities? Patricia raised an eyebrow. Should I know about social media activities? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Em and I exchanged glances. We decided not to tell Patricia about Grenarevenge 76. Partly to protect her from any ethical complications and partly because we weren't sure how she'd react to our unconventional strategy. I've been learning to use Twitter, I said carefully. Derek's lawyer might try to use it as evidence that I'm confused about technology or spending too much time online. As long as you're not posting anything that suggests cognitive impairment, social media use actually supports your case. It shows you're engaged with contemporary technology and maintaining social connections. If only she knew how engaged I'd become. We arrived at the courthouse an hour early, partly to get familiar with the surroundings and partly because Em wanted to live tweet the experience for Grenarevenge 76's growing audience she'd brought a laptop and positioned herself in the hallway where she could maintain our social media presence while I was in the courtroom. Remember, she said, whatever happens in there, we've already won something important. Thousands of people now know that this kind of abuse exists and that it's possible to fight back. Derek arrived with his lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in making unpleasant problems disappear efficiently. Derek nodded in my direction but didn't approach, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure I could maintain my composure if he tried to act like a loving son concerned for my welfare. Judge Antonia Reyes called the hearing to order at exactly 2 o'clock. She was younger than I'd expected, probably late 50s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of bearing that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. This is an emergency petition for appointment of guardian for allegedly incapacitated person, she began. Mr. Capmege, as petitioner, you may present your case first. Derek's lawyer, who introduced himself as Richard Blackwell, stood to address the court. Your Honour, we're here today because Mr. Derek Capmege is deeply concerned about his mother's welfare and her ability to continue living independently. What followed was a masterclass in how to make normal aging sound like mental incapacity. Blackwell painted a picture of a confused elderly woman living alone in a deteriorating house, unable to manage her finances or make sound decisions about her health and safety. Mrs. Capmege shows classic signs of early-stage cognitive decline, he said, consulting his notes. Repetitive conversations, difficulty with new technology, social isolation, and an increasingly stubborn refusal to accept help from family members. When Derek took the witness stand, I barely recognized the man who spoke. This version of my son was caring and concerned, reluctantly taking legal action only because he feared for my safety. She's always been independent, he testified. But, lately, she seems confused about things that should be routine. She asks me to repeat information I've already given her. She gets frustrated with simple technology. Last month, she forgot an entire conversation we'd had about my daughter's job. It was a skillful distortion of reality. Derek made my requests for clarification sound like memory loss. My frustration with his mumbled phone conversations sound like cognitive impairment, and my contentment with solitude sound like dangerous isolation. Your Honour, Derek continued, I love my mother, and I want what's best for her. She's lived in that house for over 40 years, and I understand why she's attached to it. But attachment can override safety concerns if she falls, if she has a medical emergency. If she becomes confused and wanders outside, no one would know for hours, maybe days. Blackwell concluded by requesting immediate temporary guardianship, arguing that waiting for a full competency evaluation would put me at unacceptable risk. When it was our turn, Patricia began by calling me to the witness stand. Her questions were designed to demonstrate my mental acuity and ability to manage my daily life independently. Mrs. Capmege, can you tell the court about your typical daily routine? I described my mornings in the garden, my writing schedule, my volunteer work at the library, and my evening conversations with Jasper. I detailed how I managed my medications, paid my bills, and maintained my house and garden. When you have questions about technology or need clarification during phone conversations, what do you do? I ask for help or clarification, the same way any reasonable person would. I've learned to use email, online banking, and video calling in recent years. My niece Em, who lives with me, can attest to my comfort with technology. Patricia led me through several mental exercises reciting my address and social security number, performing simple arithmetic, describing recent current events. It felt patronizing, but I understood the necessity of demonstrating my cognitive abilities for the court record. Mrs. Catmedge, how do you feel about your son's petition? This was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I feel betrayed, I said honestly. Not because Derek is concerned about my welfare, but because he chose to address those concerns through legal action rather than conversation. If he'd come to me and said, "Mom, I'm worried about you living alone," we could have discussed options. Instead, he filed papers calling me mentally incompetent without giving me any opportunity to address his concerns directly. Have you given any thought to your future living arrangements? Of course. I'm 76 years old. I'd be foolish not to plan for the possibility that I might need more support someday. But someday is not today. Today, I'm healthy, mentally sharp, and capable of managing my own life. When that changes, I'll make appropriate adjustments. Blackwell's cross-examination was designed to make me appear defensive and confused. He asked about my finances, my health, my relationships with family and neighbors. When I answered clearly and completely, he tried a different approach. Mrs. Catmedge, isn't it true that you've been spending significant time on social media lately? My heart skipped, but I kept my voice steady. I've been learning to use Twitter, yes. My niece has been teaching me about social media, and you've been posting content related to this case. Patricia objected before I could answer. Relevance, Your Honor. I'll allow it, Judge Ray said. Mrs. Catmedge, please answer the question. I've been sharing my experiences with online communities interested in elder rights issues. Would you characterize some of these posts as angry or emotional? I would characterize them as honest responses to a difficult situation. Mrs. Catmedge, do you think it's appropriate for someone involved in a competency hearing to be conducting a public relations campaign on social media? Patricia stood again. Objection. The witness's First Amendment rights are not at issue in this proceeding. Sustained. Blackwell tried several more approaches, but I could see he was fishing. He clearly knew about my social media activity, but couldn't prove I was behind the Greta Revenge 76 account. And even if he could, it would only demonstrate my technological competence and strategic thinking. After both sides rested, Judge Reyes announced that she would review the evidence and issue her decision within 48 hours. The brief hearing was over, leaving me with nothing to do but wait and worrying. Em met me in the hallway, her laptop balanced on her knees as she typed furiously. How did it go? Hard to tell. Patricia thinks we presented a strong case, but emergency hearings are unpredictable. Well, the internet is definitely paying attention. Hashtag Greta Revenge is trending, and your story is being shared by major accounts. A reporter from the Washington Post just messaged asking for an interview. The idea that my personal family crisis had become a national news story was surreal, but I was grateful for the attention. Whether or not it influenced Judge Reyes, it was shining a light on issues that typically remained hidden in family court proceedings. That evening, Em and I sat on the front porch despite the October chill, watching the last light fade from the sky. Jasper joined us with a thermos of hot chocolate, and we filled him in on the day's events. You know, he said thoughtfully, regardless of what the judge decides, you've already accomplished something remarkable. A month ago, you were just one elderly woman facing a legal challenge. Now you're the center of a national conversation about elder rights. I never intended to become a symbol, I said. The best symbols rarely do, Jasper replied. They just stand up for what's right and let other people decide what it means. As we went inside for the night, Em showed me the latest metrics from our social media campaign. Greta Revenge 76 now had over 50,000 followers, and our hashtag had been used in tens of thousands of posts. Major news outlets were preparing stories about our case, and legal advocacy groups were using it to push for guardianship reform. Win or lose, Em said, Uncle Derek is never going to live this down. He's become the poster child for financial elder abuse. I felt a twinge of sadness about that. Whatever Derek had become, I'd still raised him, still loved the child he'd been. But the man who'd filed those papers had made his choice, and choices of consequences. Lying in bed that night, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A month ago, my biggest concern had been whether the late tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. Now I was waiting to learn whether a judge would decide I was competent to continue living my own life. But even if Judge Reyes ruled against me, I knew I'd fought back with every tool at my disposal. I'd refused to be silenced, dismissed, or erased, and perhaps that was victory enough. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp boredom clarity that makes every colour more vivid and every sound more distinct. I was deadheading the last of my chrysanthemums when Em burst through the front door, her laptop clutched against her chest and her eyes wide with excitement. "And Ollie, you need to see this." Right now, I followed her into the kitchen, where she immediately opened her laptop and began pulling up browser windows. I've been monitoring mentions of Uncle Derek's name online, just keeping track of how the story is spreading. And this morning, I found something incredible. She turned the screen toward me, showing what appeared to be a local news website. The headline read, "Portland developer under investigation for construction fraud." My stomach dropped as I read the article. Derek's company, CapMedge Development, was being investigated by the Oregon Attorney General's office for allegedly defrauding investors in his luxury condominium project. According to the report, Derek had been using money from new investors to pay back earlier investors while misrepresenting the project's financial status and completion timeline. This was published yesterday evening, Em said, while we were in court. But here's the really interesting part. Look at this. She pulled up another browser tab, showing an email account I didn't recognize. Someone sent this to the Grana Revenge 76 account about an hour ago. From an anonymous email address, the message was brief. "Check your DMs on Twitter. You're going to want to see what I sent you." Em navigated to our Twitter account and showed me a series of direct messages from an account called Construction Sciencer. The messages contain links to what appeared to be internal company documents, financial reports, investor communications, and bank statements that painted a devastating picture of Derek's business practices. "These documents show that Uncle Derek has been running a Ponzi scheme," Em said, her voice hushed with disbelief. "He's been taking money from new investors to pay fake returns to earlier investors while the actual construction project burns through cash. According to these bank statements, he's personally withdrawn over $200,000 from company accounts in the past 6 months. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would have access to this kind of information? Someone inside his company, an accountant, maybe, or a business partner. Someone who knows where all the bodies are buried. The implications were staggering. Derek hadn't just been trying to steal my house to fund his business, he'd been stealing from investors to fund his lifestyle while his company collapsed around him. The timing of his competency petition now made perfect sense. He needed immediate access to liquid assets to cover his tracks before the investigation exposed the full extent of his fraud. "Em," I said slowly, "how legally compromised would Derek be if these documents are authentic? If they're real?" "He's looking at serious federal charges. Mail fraud, investor fraud. We're talking potential decades in prison." My phone rang, startling us both. The caller ID showed Patricia Chong's number. "Mrs. CapMedge." Patricia said without preamble, "Have you seen the news about your son's business?" "I'm looking at it now. This changes everything. If Derek is under criminal investigation for financial crimes, it completely undermines his credibility as someone concerned about your welfare. I'm going to file an emergency motion with the court this morning." "What kind of motion?" "To dismiss the guardianship petition entirely. Derek has a clear financial motive for gaining control of your assets, and his criminal exposure makes him unsuitable as a guardian even if you were incapacitated, which you're obviously not." After Patricia hung up, Em and I spent the morning verifying the information from our anonymous source. The documents appeared legitimate, matching publicly available information about Derek's company and including details that would be difficult to fabricate. "I think we should share this," Em said. "Not the confidential documents, those were sent to us privately." But the public information about the investigation is fair game for Grenarevenge76 to comment on. I agreed, and M crafted a thread that connected Derek's legal troubles to his guardianship petition. Thread: remember the loving son who wanted to protect his poor, confused mother by taking control of her finances. Turns out he's under investigation for defrauding investors and might need those finances to pay lawyers and restitution. Funny how family concern looks a lot like self-interest. The thread exploded across social media, generating thousands of retweets and comments from people expressing outrage at Derek's hypocrisy. Several major news outlets picked up the story, and by Sunday morning, the connection between Derek's criminal investigation and his guardianship petition was being discussed on national television. But the real bombshell came Sunday afternoon, when M's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "This is M. Cap-Medge," she answered, putting the call on speaker. "Miss Cap-Medge, this is Sarah Martinez from Pacific Northwest Magazine. I've been following the Grenarevenge76 story, and I have some information you might find interesting." We'd spoken with Sarah before about elder abuse issues, but her tone today was different, more urgent, more excited. "I've been investigating your uncle's business for the past 6 months as part of a larger story about construction fraud in Oregon. When the Grenarevenge76 story broke, I realized there might be a connection." "What kind of connection?" M asked. "Derek Cap-Medge's business partner reached out to me yesterday. He wants to go on the record about the company's financial problems and Derek's personal behavior. According to him, Derek has been talking for months about solving his cash flow problems by gaining access to family money." My blood went cold. Derek was planning this for months. According to his partner, yes, Derek specifically mentioned that his mother was sitting on valuable real estate and savings that could bridge the gap until their development projects started generating revenue. M and I looked at each other in shock. This wasn't a case of a son gradually becoming concerned about his mother's welfare. This was premeditated financial exploitation, planned and executed with cold calculation. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The partner says Derek hired a private investigator to follow your aunt and document any behavior that could be used as evidence of incompetence." A private investigator. I felt violated in a way that went beyond Derek's legal betrayal. "Yes, Derek apparently wanted photographs of your aunt looking confused or disoriented, evidence of home maintenance issues, anything that could support a competency petition." "Did the investigator find anything?" According to the partner, no. The investigator reported that your aunt appeared healthy, alert, and completely capable of managing her affairs. Derek was frustrated and considered dropping the idea, but his financial situation became too desperate to wait. After Sarah hung up, promising to send us a copy of her article before it published, Em and I sat in stunned silence. The depth of Derek's betrayal was breathtaking. He hadn't just filed a frivolous legal petition, he'd spent months planning to steal my life and my freedom to cover his own crimes. "And Oli," Em said, finally, "I think we need to contact the FBI." The FBI. If Uncle Derek hired a private investigator to gather false evidence for a fraudulent guardianship petition while he was under investigation for investor fraud, that's a federal crime. Conspiracy may be RICO violations if it's part of a larger pattern. The idea of involving federal law enforcement in what had started as a family dispute felt surreal, but Em was right. Derek's actions had crossed the line from family betrayal into criminal conspiracy. Before I could respond, my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see two people in dark suits standing on my porch. One of them held up a badge. "FBI," the woman announced when I opened the door. "We'd like to speak with Mrs. Oli Cap-Medge about the guardianship petition filed by her son." Agent Jennifer Walsh and Agent Michael Torres sat in my living room, their presence somehow making the familiar space feel official and strange. Agent Walsh did most of the talking while Agent Torres took notes. Double quotes, "Mrs. Cap-Medge, we're investigating financial crimes related to your son's business. We understand he's filed a petition for guardianship over you." "That's correct. We have reason to believe that petition might be connected to his financial crimes. Would you be willing to tell us about the circumstances surrounding the petition?" I told them everything: Derek's sudden interest in my living situation, the emergency hearing, my discovery of his business troubles. Agent Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or dates. Mrs. Catmedge, have you noticed anyone watching your house or following you in recent months? No, but a journalist just told us that Derek hired a private investigator to document my behavior. The agents exchanged glances. We'll need to follow up on that. In the meantime, we want you to know that the guardianship petition is likely to be dismissed given your son's criminal exposure, but you should continue working with your lawyer to make sure your rights are protected. After the FBI agents left, Em and I sat on the front porch, trying to process the day's revelations. What had started as a fight for my independence had become a federal investigation into a criminal conspiracy. I keep thinking about that little boy who used to help me can tomatoes, I said. How did he become someone capable of this? Em reached over and squeezed my hand. I don't know, Aunt Ollie, but I know that little boy would be proud of how you fought. Back that evening, Judge Reyes called with her decision. The guardianship petition was dismissed entirely, with a scathing written order that cited Derek's clear financial conflicts of interest and lack of credible evidence of incapacity. She also noted that my vigorous and articulate self-advocacy demonstrated exactly the kind of mental competence the law was designed to protect. As word of the decision spread on social media, Granny Revenge 76's followers exploded past 100,000. Messages of support poured in from around the world, with people calling me an inspiration and a symbol of resistance against elder abuse. But sitting in my garden that night, watching the last light fade from the October sky, I felt less like a symbol and more like a mother who'd lost her son. Derek's crimes had freed me from his legal attack, but they'd also revealed the extent to which the child I'd raised had disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust. The victory felt hollow, purchased at the cost of a relationship I'd cherished for 48 years. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in my own house, in control of my own life, surrounded by people who cared about me. But I'd also wake up knowing that my son was facing federal charges and that our family would never be the same. Sometimes winning costs more than you ever imagined you'd have to pay. The aftermath of Judge Rey's decision brought a strange mix of relief and sadness that I hadn't anticipated. Em organized a small celebration dinner with Jasper and Patricia, but I found myself distracted by thoughts of Derek and what his life would look like in the coming months. You're thinking about him, aren't you? Em said, finding me on the porch after dinner. He's still my son. Em, whatever he's done, I raised him. I remember teaching him to ride a bicycle, helping him with homework, bandaging his scraped knees. That doesn't just disappear because he made terrible choices as an adult. You can love someone and still protect yourself from them, Em said. Gently, that's what you did here. She was right, of course. But understanding the necessity of my actions didn't make them hurt less. Tuesday brought news that Derek had been arrested on federal fraud charges. The story made national headlines, with many outlets connecting his criminal case to the guardianship petition that had started our social media campaign. Granny Revenge 76 had become a symbol of elder empowerment that transcended my personal situation. I found myself in the odd position of being famous for something I couldn't publicly claim credit for. Interview requests poured in for both Oli KPMEDG and Granny Revenge 76, but maintaining my anonymity meant I could only watch as other people discussed my story on television and in magazines. Have you thought about revealing yourself? Em asked. One evening as we watched a panel discussion about elder abuse on CNN, going public as Granny Revenge 76, not yet, I said. I think this story is more powerful when it's not about one specific person. It lets people project their own experiences onto it. The criminal case against Derek moved quickly through the federal system. His business partner had indeed cooperated with the FBI, providing evidence of the Ponzi scheme and Derek's plan to use guardianship to access my assets. The private investigator also came forward, admitting he'd been hired to find evidence of my incapacity, but had found none. Derek pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution to the investors he'd defrauded. The house I'd lived in for 43 years was safe, but the son I'd raised for 48 years was gone, 3 months after Derek's sentencing. I found myself sitting in the visitors' parking lot of the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon, staring at a building that looked nothing like the prisons in movies. It was modern and institutional, surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire, but somehow less dramatically imposing than I'd expected. M had offered to drive me, but this was something I needed to do alone. I'd been wrestling with the decision to visit Derek since his conviction, torn between my anger at his betrayal and my enduring love for the child he'd been. Patricia had advised against it, warning that anything Derek said could potentially be used in future legal proceedings. But there were questions that only he could answer, and I'd reached the point where not knowing hurt more than the risk of what I might learn. The visiting process was more elaborate than I'd anticipated. I'd had to submit to a background check, provide identification, and follow strict rules about what I could and couldn't bring into the facility. My purse had been searched. I'd walked through a metal detector, and I'd been patted down by a female guard who was professional but thorough. Now I sat in a large room filled with plastic tables and chairs, waiting for Derek to appear through a door marked authorized personnel only. Other families were scattered around the room, wives visiting husbands, children visiting fathers, mothers visiting sons. The conversations were quiet, sometimes strained, often emotional. When Derek finally emerged, my first thought was how much weight he'd lost. The expensive suits had been replaced by a khaki uniform that hung loosely on his frame, and his hair had more grey than I remembered. But it was his eyes that shocked me most. They held a hollow quality I'd never seen before, as if something essential had been extinguished. "Hi, Mom," he said, sitting across from me at one of the plastic tables. His voice was smaller than I remembered, lacking the confident tone that had characterized our phone conversations over the years. "Hello, Derek." For several minutes, we sat in awkward silence. I'd practiced what I wanted to say during the drive to Sheridan, but now that we were face to face, the words felt inadequate. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said finally. "I wasn't sure I would either. How are you doing?" "With the house, I mean, and everything. I'm fine, Derek. The house is fine. My life is exactly as it was before you tried to steal it from me." He flinched at the directness of my words, but I decided that this conversation would be honest or it wouldn't happen at all. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just because I got caught, but because I lost sight of who I was supposed to be, who you raised me to be. What happened to you, Derek? When did you become someone capable of hiring investigators to spy on your own mother?" Derek stared at his hands, which were folded on the table between us. "It started small. The business was struggling, and I made some bad decisions trying to keep it afloat. Then I made worse decisions trying to fix the bad ones. Before I knew it, I was in so deep that I couldn't see any way out except stealing from your mother. I told myself it wasn't stealing. I convinced myself that you'd want to help. If you understood the situation, that I was just accessing the money earlier than I would have inherited it anyway. But you never asked me to help, because I knew you'd ask questions I couldn't answer. You'd want to know about the business, the investors, the loans. And once you knew the truth about what I'd done, you never would have helped." Derek's honesty was more painful than his lies had been. He'd known that his crimes made him unworthy of my help, so he decided to take what he needed by force. "The guardianship petition was your solution. My lawyer said it was the cleanest approach. Get temporary guardianship, sell the house, use the proceeds to pay back the investors, and hopefully avoid criminal charges. Then, once everything was settled, I could have the guardianship reversed. And if I'd actually been incompetent, if I'd genuinely needed protection rather than exploitation." Derek was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. "I don't think I let myself consider that possibility. I needed you to be competent enough that I could eventually reverse the guardianship, but incompetent enough that no one would question my motives." The calculated nature of his plan was breathtaking. He'd needed me to be precisely the right amount of vulnerable enough to justify legal intervention, not enough to make that intervention permanent. "Derek, do you understand that what you did was elder abuse? That you used the legal system to terrorize your own mother? I understand that now. At the time, I was so focused on solving my financial problems that I didn't think about what it would feel like from your perspective. I didn't consider how terrifying it would be to have your own son claim you were incompetent. You hired someone to follow me, to photograph me, to look for evidence that I was losing my mind. That was my lowest point. Even then, I knew it was wrong. But I was desperate, and desperate people do terrible things. We sat in silence again, the weight of his admission settling between us. Around the room, other families continued their visits, but I felt isolated in our bubble of shared history and mutual pain. What happens now? I asked. I served my time. 8 years, probably 6 with good behavior. I try to become someone you could be proud of again. And what about us? What about our relationship? Derek looked up at me for the first time since he'd started confessing. I don't know, Mom. I'd like to think we could rebuild something someday, but I understand if you can't forgive what I did. I understand if you never want to see me again. The honest answer was that I didn't know either. The Derek sitting across from me seemed genuinely remorseful, but remorse didn't undo the damage he'd caused. It didn't erase the months of terror I'd experienced, wondering if I would lose my home and my independence. It didn't restore the trust that had been shattered when I discovered my own son was willing to destroy my life for money. I need time. I said finally, I need to figure out who you are now, and who I am in relation to that person. I understand, Derek. There's something else I need to tell you. Something you should know about what happened after you filed the guardianship petition. I told him about Grenarevenge 76, about our social media campaign, about how his actions had inadvertently sparked a national conversation about elder abuse. Derek listened with growing amazement as I described the viral threads, the media coverage, the thousands of people who'd shared their own stories of family betrayal. You did all that? He asked when I finished. And I did it together. Your 26-year-old niece taught your 76-year-old mother how to fight back using tools you never imagined I'd master. And people responded, Derek, your guardianship petition made me accidentally famous. Grenarevenge 76 has over 200,000 followers now. I've been invited to speak at conferences about elder rights. Lawyers are using our case to push for guardianship reform. Derek shook his head slowly. I underestimated you completely. Yes, you did. You underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my capacity to adapt to new situations. You made the same mistake our culture makes about older people. You assume that age equals helplessness. I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. I know you are. But sorry doesn't fix everything that's been broken. When our visit ended, I walked back to my car feeling emotionally drained, but oddly relieved. Seeing Derek in prison hadn't provided the closure I'd hoped for, but it had given me something equally valuable, confirmation that my son was still in there somewhere, buried under the layers of poor choices and criminal behavior. The drive home took me through the familiar countryside of Western Oregon, past farms and forests that had remained unchanged, while my family had imploded. I thought about forgiveness, about redemption, about whether it was possible to love someone while acknowledging that they tried to destroy your life. By the time I reached Salem, I'd made a decision. I would continue to visit Derek, not because I'd forgiven him, but because understanding what had happened to him was part of understanding what had happened to me. His story and mine were intertwined in ways that couldn't be undone by prison walls or legal judgments. That evening, I sat at my computer and began writing what would become my most personal Grenarevenge 76 thread yet. I wrote about visiting someone you love in prison, about the complicated emotions of seeing your own child in shackles, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Today, I visited someone who tried to steal my life, I wrote. I went hoping for answers and got something more valuable, the reminder that people are capable of both terrible crimes and genuine remorse. Healing doesn't require forgiveness, but it does require truth, and sometimes the truth is more complicated than we want it to be. The thread generated thousands of responses from people sharing their own experiences with family members who'd committed crimes, with parents who'd betrayed their children's trust, with the complex emotions that arise when love and harm become entangled. As I read through the comments, I realized that my story had evolved beyond the simple narrative of elder abuse that had first gone viral. It had become a meditation on family, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption even in the aftermath of profound betrayal. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything again. Em answered with her usual cheerful hello, but her expression quickly grew serious. "And Ollie," she said, covering the phone's mouthpiece, "it's someone from 60 Minutes. They want to interview Granarevenge 76 for a segment about elder abuse and social media activism." I stared at her, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd have to get back to them." "But Aunt Ollie, this is huge. 60 Minutes reaches millions of people. If you did this interview, it could change laws, change how people think about aging and autonomy." I thought about Derek in his prison uniform, about the hollow look in his eyes, about the thousands of families dealing with similar betrayals in silence. I thought about the elderly people who might be facing competency hearings right now, who might benefit from seeing that it was possible to fight back and win. "Em," I said slowly, "I think it's time for Granarevenge 76 to reveal her true identity." The decision to appear on 60 Minutes as myself, as both Ollie Kapmedg and Granarevenge 76, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. For months, I'd been able to advocate for elder rights while maintaining the privacy that had always been precious to me. But Em was right, the platform offered by a national television show could reach people who might never see our Twitter threads, might never discover our story through social media algorithms. Patricia advised against it from a legal perspective, warning that public exposure could complicate any future family legal issues. But she also acknowledged that my case had evolved beyond personal family drama into something larger, something that could benefit from mainstream media attention. The 60 Minutes producer, a woman named Rebecca Chan, flew to Portland to meet with us. She'd been following the Granarevenge 76 story since our early viral threads and was particularly interested in how we'd use social media to fight back against institutional ageism. "What strikes me about your case," Rebecca said, sitting in my living room with a camera crew setting up around us, "is how it demonstrates the power of digital activism to amplify voices that are usually silenced. Elder abuse typically happens in isolation, behind closed doors. Your decision to make it public created accountability that didn't exist within the legal system alone." She was right. The court system had ultimately protected me, but only after our social media campaign had made Derek's actions too notorious to ignore. Judge Reyes had mentioned in her written decision that the significant public interest in the case had reinforced her determination to issue a thorough and carefully reasoned ruling. The interview itself lasted 3 hours, though only a fraction would make it to air. Rebecca asked about Derek's childhood, about the progression of his business problems, about the specific tactics he'd used to build his case for my incompetency. She was particularly interested in the role social media had played in both exposing and fighting elder abuse. Double quotes, "Mrs. Kapmedg," she said during one segment, "You learned to use Twitter at age 76 specifically to fight your son's guardianship petition. What does that say about assumptions we make about older people and technology?" "It says that we consistently underestimate older adults," I replied. "We assume that if you need reading glasses, you must be confused by computers. If you ask someone to speak up, you must be cognitively impaired. These assumptions become weapons in the hands of people who want to control elderly family members. And your message to other older adults facing similar situations: fight back, use every tool available to you. Don't accept other people's definitions of your capabilities, and don't be afraid to ask for help from younger family members who understand these digital platforms." Em didn't just teach me to use Twitter, she helped me find my voice in a space where age can be an asset rather than a liability. The 60 Minutes segment aired on a Sunday evening in December, 6 months after Derek's original guardianship petition. Em and I watched it together, along with Jasper and Patricia, in my living room. Seeing my story reduced to 15 minutes of television was surreal, but Rebecca had captured the essential elements with remarkable clarity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Granarevenge 76's follower count exploded past 500,000 within hours of the broadcast. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from other news organizations, invitations to speak at conferences, and messages from elder rights organizations, asking me to serve on boards and advisory committees. More importantly, the segment sparked conversations in families across the country. People called their elderly parents and grandparents, asking about their wishes for future care and making sure they understood their legal rights. Adult children who might have been considering guardianship proceedings instead initiated honest conversations about support and independence. "You've created a cultural moment," Em said, showing me the latest social media metrics. "Grana Revenge has become bigger than either of us imagined." She was right, but the success felt bittersweet. I'd gained a national platform and helped countless people, but I'd lost my son in the process. Derek was serving his sentence in federal prison while I was being celebrated as a symbol of elder empowerment. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 weeks after the 60-minute segment aired, I received a letter from Derek. It was the first communication we'd had since my visit to the prison, and I opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Mum," it began, "I watched your interview from the prison common room. I've never been more proud of you or more ashamed of myself. You turned my worst impulses into something beautiful and meaningful. You took the pain I caused you and transformed it into hope for other people. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday I can deserve your pride again." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing his daily routine in prison, his participation in educational programs, and his plans for rebuilding his life after release. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to my eyes. "I know I can't undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that watching you fight back has reminded me of the mother who taught me to stand up for what's right. I lost my way completely, but you never lost yours. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to turn terrible situations into forces for good. I love you, Mum. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of that love again." Em found me crying in the kitchen. Derek's letter spread on the table in front of me. "Bad news?" she asked gently. "No," I said, wiping my eyes. "Complicated news, but not bad." The invitation to testify before the Senate Special Committee on Aging arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, nearly a year after Derek's initial guardianship. Petition: I was in the garden, planting the early peas that Henry had always insisted should go in the ground by St. Patrick's Day, when Em came running outside with an official-looking envelope in her hands. "And Ollie," she said breathlessly. "This is from the United States Senate." I wiped my muddy hands on my gardening apron and opened the letter carefully. The formal language made it sound like a summons, but Em's excited reading revealed it was actually an invitation, a request for me to appear as a witness at a hearing on guardianship reform and elder abuse prevention. "They want Grana Revenge 76 to testify before Congress," Em said, her voice rising with excitement. "They want you to tell your story to the people who can actually change the laws." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks away, giving me time to prepare testimony, but not enough time to fully process the magnitude of the moment. In 18 months, I'd gone from a retired librarian tending her garden to a national advocate testifying before the United States Senate. The transformation felt both inevitable and impossible. Patricia helped me understand the legal context of my testimony. "Congress is considering the Stop Elder Abuse Act," she explained, "which would strengthen federal oversight of guardianship proceedings and create new protections for elderly adults facing competency challenges. Your case has become the poster child for why these reforms are necessary." Over the following weeks, I worked with them and Patricia to craft testimony that would tell my personal story while illustrating the broader systemic issues we'd uncovered. We contacted some of the people who'd shared their own experiences through Grana Revenge 76, gathering additional examples of how current laws failed to protect vulnerable adults. The night before flying to Washington, I sat in Henry's reading chair, looking over my prepared remarks and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd been focused on the narrow goal of keeping my house and my independence. Now I was preparing to address the institution that could prevent thousands of other families from experiencing what Derek and I had been through. Jasper found me there at nearly midnight, holding 2 cups of chamomile tea. "Nervous?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Terrified," I admitted. "What if I forget what I want to say? What if the senators don't take me seriously? What if I can't adequately represent all the people who've shared their stories with me? Ollie, Jasper said gently, you've been representing those people for a year now. You've already changed how thousands of families think about aging and autonomy. Tomorrow is just one more conversation in a series of conversations you've been having since this whole thing started. He was right, but the setting felt so formal, so intimidating. Social media had allowed me to speak authentically, in my own voice, at my own pace. Congressional testimony would be different, more structured, more scrutinized, more permanent. The flight to Washington was my first time on an airplane since Henry's death, and Em insisted on accompanying me despite my protest that I could manage alone. You've spent a year proving you don't need help, she said, but that doesn't mean you can't accept it when it's offered. The Hart Senate office building was more imposing than I'd expected, all marble and authority and the weight of history. Em and I were escorted to a preparation room where I could review my testimony one final time before the hearing began. Remember, Patricia had coached me. Senators love personal stories, but they also need policy recommendations. Tell them what happened to you, but also tell them how to prevent it from happening to others. The hearing room was smaller than it appeared on television, but somehow more intimate and more intimidating simultaneously. Senators sat elevated behind a curved desk, looking down at a witness table where I would soon be sitting. Gallery seating behind me was filled with advocates, journalists, and other people whose lives had been touched by guardianship abuse. I wasn't the only witness that day. A social worker from California testified about systemic problems in her state's guardianship system. A lawyer from New York described cases where professional guardians had financially exploited their wards. A researcher from Georgetown University presented statistics about the scope of elder abuse in America. But when my name was called, and I walked to the witness table, I felt the particular weight of representing not just myself, but the thousands of people who'd found their voices through Granny Revenge 76. Mrs. Catmedge, said Senator Margaret Rodriguez, the committee chair. Thank you for appearing before us today. We understand you have a personal story that illustrates many of the issues this committee is working to address. Thank you, Senator Rodriguez. I do indeed. I began with the morning I discovered Derek's petition, describing the shock and terror of learning that my own son wanted to have me declared mentally incompetent. But I quickly moved beyond the personal narrative to the broader patterns we'd identified through our social media advocacy. Senators, my case isn't unique. It's representative of a system that's supposed to protect vulnerable adults, but too often enables their exploitation. Current guardianship laws create perverse incentives for family members facing financial pressure, while providing inadequate safeguards for the people they're supposed to protect. I outlined the specific reforms that our community had identified as necessary: mandatory cooling-off periods between filing and hearing, requirements for independent medical evaluations, financial disclosure requirements for petitioners, and enhanced rights for people facing competency challenges. Most importantly, I said, looking directly at the senators, we need to change the presumption that guides these proceedings. Currently, the burden is on elderly adults to prove they're competent. It should be on petitioners to prove that guardianship is truly necessary and that they're acting in good faith. Senator James Whitfield from Texas leaned forward. Mrs. Catmedge, you mentioned that your son was facing financial difficulties when he filed his petition. How common is this kind of financial motivation in guardianship cases? More common than anyone wants to admit. Senator, through our social media advocacy, we've heard from hundreds of families dealing with similar situations. Adult children with gambling debts, business failures, or other financial pressures who see elderly parents as potential solutions to their problems. And the current system doesn't adequately screen for these conflicts of interest. Not at all. In my case, Derek's financial crimes weren't discovered until after he'd filed his petition. If his Ponzi scheme had been better concealed, he might have successfully gained control of my assets before anyone realized his true motives. Senator Lisa Chan from Oregon asked about the role social media had played in our fight. Mrs. Catmedge, you learned to use Twitter specifically to advocate for yourself. What does that suggest about assumptions we make about older adults and technology? Senator Chen, one of the most damaging myths about aging is that older people can adapt to new technologies or new situations. Derek counted on that assumption when he filed his petition. He expected me to fight him through traditional channels quietly, privately, within a system that was rigged against me. But you chose a different approach. With my niece's help, yes. We used social media to expose the tactics Derek was using and to connect with other families facing similar situations. What we discovered was that elder abuse thrives in isolation and secrecy. When you shine a light on it, when you make it public, it becomes much harder to sustain. Senator Rodriguez asked about the long-term impact of our advocacy. Mrs. Katmej, Granareven76 now has over 1 million followers. How has that platform evolved since your personal case was resolved? Senator, we've become a clearinghouse for information about elder rights and a support network for families dealing with guardianship abuse. We've helped people find lawyers, connected them with advocacy organizations, and provided practical advice about fighting back against frivolous petitions. And you've continued this work even though your own case is resolved, because my case is resolved, Senator. I have the luxury of security and the responsibility that comes with a platform. Too many people facing guardianship challenges don't have those advantages. The most difficult questions came from Senator Robert Hayes from Florida, who seemed skeptical of some aspects of my story. Mrs. Katmej, isn't it possible that your son was genuinely concerned about your welfare, regardless of his financial problems? Couldn't his petition have been motivated by love rather than greed? I'd been expecting this question and had prepared for it carefully. Senator Hayes, that's exactly the kind of assumption that makes elder abuse so easy to perpetrate and so difficult to prosecute. The language of concern and love can mask the most exploitative behavior. But surely some guardianship petitions are filed with good intentions. Absolutely, Senator, and those petitions should be supported by clear medical evidence, transparent financial disclosures, and genuine efforts to include the elderly person in decision-making. My son's petition included none of those elements. How do we distinguish between genuine concern and exploitation? By looking at the evidence rather than accepting good intentions at face value. By requiring petitioners to demonstrate that they've tried less restrictive alternatives. By ensuring that elderly people have adequate representation and meaningful opportunities to respond to allegations against them. The hearing lasted 3 hours, with breaks for votes and other Senate business. During one recess, I was approached by advocates from various organizations who wanted to continue working together on reform efforts. Mrs. Katmej said, Dr. Sarah Williams from the National Center on Elder Abuse, your testimony was incredibly powerful. Would you consider joining our advisory board? Or speaking at our annual conference, added Robert Martinez from the Elder Justice Coalition. Your story has inspired a whole generation of elder rights activists. I was flattered, but also overwhelmed by the attention. A year earlier, my biggest ambition had been finishing my weekly story for the literary magazine and keeping my tomatoes healthy through the summer. Now people were asking me to shape national policy and lead advocacy organizations. The most meaningful moment came during the final recess, when a woman in her 80s approached me with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Katmej, she said, my daughter tried to have me declared incompetent last year. I saw your story and decided to fight back. I kept my independence because you showed me it was possible. These were the conversations that made everything worthwhile. Individual people whose lives had been changed by our decision to fight back publicly rather than suffer in silence. My closing statement to the committee summarized what I'd learned over the previous year. Senators, elder abuse isn't just a family problem or a social problem, it's a civil rights issue. When we allow elderly people to be stripped of their autonomy without adequate due process, when we enable financial exploitation through weak oversight systems, when we treat aging as synonymous with incompetence, we're violating the fundamental principles that should guide our democracy. The Stop Elder Abuse Act won't solve every problem, but it will send a clear message that older Americans deserve the same legal protections as any other group. They deserve to be heard, to be represented, to be treated with dignity rather than dismissed as burdens waiting to be managed. I'm 77 years old now, and I've learned more in the past year than in some entire decades of my life. I've learned that age can be a source of wisdom and power rather than vulnerability. I've learned that technology can amplify voices that might otherwise be silenced. And I've learned that one person's decision to fight back can inspire thousands of others to do the same. Don't let us be invisible, senators. Don't let us be voiceless. Help us change the systems that enable abuse and strengthen the protections that preserve dignity. When I finished speaking, the gallery erupted in applause, a breach of Senate protocol that Senator Rodriguez allowed to continue for several moments before gaveling for ordre d'art and I left the Capitol building that afternoon. I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because our work was finished, the legislation still needed to pass, and there would always be more families to help, but because I'd finally articulated what this journey had taught me about aging, advocacy, and the power of refusing to be silenced. How do you feel? Em asked as we waited for our taxi to the airport. Like I've become someone I never expected to be, I said. And like that might be exactly who I was supposed to become all along. The flight home to Oregon felt different from the journey to Washington. I was returning not as a victim seeking justice, but as an advocate who'd found her voice and learned to use it effectively. The weight of representing so many people's stories had been heavy, but carrying it had made me stronger rather than breaking me down. M spent the flight editing video of my testimony for Grana Revenge 76's social media accounts. While I looked out the window at the country passing below and thought about Derek, he'd been watching the hearing from prison, according to his latest letter, and had written that seeing me testify had filled him with both pride and shame. Pride at who I'd become, shame at what it had taken to get me there. Do you think any of this would have happened if Uncle Derek hadn't filed that petition? Em asked as we began our descent into Portland. You mean would I have become an advocate anyway? Yeah. Do you think this was always inside you, waiting for the right trigger? I considered the question. I think I was always someone who believed in standing up for what's right. But I don't know if I would have found the courage to do it on such a public scale without being forced into it. Sometimes we need our backs against the wall to discover what we're really capable of. The taxi from the airport took us through familiar neighborhoods, past the houses and gardens that had been my world before everything changed. It felt like returning to a place I'd left years ago rather than days ago, as if the experience in Washington had altered my relationship to home itself. Jasper was waiting on my front porch when we arrived, holding a bouquet of early daffodils from his garden and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he'd been following every moment of the hearing online. How did it feel to address the United States Senate? He asked as he helped carry my luggage inside. Terrifying and empowering in equal measure, I said. Like everything else about this experience, that evening, the three of us sat in the kitchen, while I decompressed from the intensity of the day. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of congratulation and support, but I found myself more interested in the quiet satisfaction of being back in my own space, surrounded by people who'd known me before I became Grana Revenge 76. What happens next? Jasper asked. The committee will mark up the bill, and if it passes there, it goes to the full Senate, I explained. But that could take months, and there's no guarantee it will become law. I meant what happens next for you, he clarified. You've become a national figure. Do you keep doing this work? It was a question I'd been avoiding, but the success of the hearing had made it unavoidable. Organizations across the country wanted me to speak at conferences, serve on boards, and help them develop advocacy strategies. Book publishers were interested in my story, and television producers wanted to develop documentaries about our social media campaign. I think, I said slowly, that I want to keep doing this work, but on my own terms. I never wanted to become a professional activist. I just wanted to keep my house and my independence. But now that I've seen how many people need help, I can't just walk away. But you also can't save everyone, Em said gently. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. She was right. Of course, I'd helped thousands of people find their voices, influenced national legislation, and created a model for how older adults could use technology to fight back against abuse. But I'd also learned that advocacy work could consume your entire life if you let it. and I wasn't ready to let go of the quiet pleasures that had sustained me through 76 years of living. 1 year later, I stood in the rose garden of the White House, watching President Chen sign the Stop Elder Abuse Act into law. The legislation that had begun as a response to isolated cases of guardianship abuse had evolved into comprehensive reform that would protect millions of older Americans from exploitation. M stood beside me, now working full-time for the Elder Justice Coalition and traveling the country to help families fight guardianship abuse. She had grown into her role as a professional advocate, but she still lived with me in Salem, claiming that her commute to Portland was easier from my house than from anywhere else. I suspected she stayed more for the company than the convenience, and I was grateful for both. "Can you believe we're here?" she whispered as the president approached the signing table. "No," I admitted. "A year and a half ago, I was worried about aphids on my roses. Now I'm watching legislation I helped write become federal law." The path from congressional testimony to presidential signature had been longer and more complex than any of us had anticipated. The bill had been modified several times as it moved through Congress, with compromises that weakened some provisions while strengthening others. But the core protections we'd advocated for remained intact: mandatory cooling-off periods, independent medical evaluations, financial disclosure requirements, and enhanced due process rights for people facing competency challenges. Senator Rodriguez had insisted that I be present for the signing ceremony, calling me the citizen advocate whose courage sparked a national movement. The description still felt strange, but I'd learned to accept that my personal fight with Derek had indeed become something larger than either of us had intended. The president's remarks before signing emphasized the bipartisan nature of the legislation and its importance for protecting vulnerable Americans. The Stop Elder Abuse Act recognizes that older adults deserve the same constitutional protections as any other citizens, she said. It ensures that concerns about someone's welfare cannot be used as weapons to strip away their autonomy. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the East Room where I found myself surrounded by advocates, lawmakers, and other people whose lives had been touched by guardianship abuse. Many of them had become part of the extended Granarevenge 7-6 community, sharing resources and supporting each other through ongoing legal battles. Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd become a close friend and collaborator, raised her glass during an informal toast to Oli Katmej, who proved that one person's decision to fight back can change the world. The toast was kind, but not entirely accurate. I hadn't changed the world, alone I'd been part of a community of people who'd shared their stories, amplified each other's voices, and refused to accept that elder abuse was an inevitable part of aging. Granarevenge 7-6 had succeeded because it represented thousands of people, not just one angry grandmother with a Twitter account. The flight home to Oregon gave me time to reflect on everything that had changed since Derek's first guardianship petition. The external changes were obvious: national recognition, a federal law bearing my influence, speaking engagements scheduled months in advance. But the internal changes felt more significant. I discovered that I was braver than I'd known, more adaptable than I'd believed, and more powerful than society had taught me to expect at my age. I'd learned that technology could be a tool for justice rather than just entertainment, that strangers could become allies, and that speaking truth publicly could create change in ways that private suffering never could. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that aging didn't have to mean becoming invisible or voiceless. It could mean becoming wiser, more strategic, and more determined to use whatever time remained for purposes that mattered. 2 weeks after returning from Washington, I received a letter from Derek that would change our relationship forever. He was being released early for good behavior and participation in educational programs, with 6 months to serve in a halfway house before full release. "Mom," he wrote, "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I'm hoping we might be able to have a conversation about what comes next. Not about forgiveness, I understand that may never be possible, but about whether there's any way for me to earn back even a small portion of your trust. I've been thinking about what you said during your Senate testimony about how elder abuse is a civil rights issue. You're right, and I was part of the problem. I want to spend whatever time I've left being part of the solution instead." The letter went on to describe Derek's plan to work with elder justice organizations after his release, using his experience as both perpetrator and son to help other families navigate the complex emotions that arise when financial pressure and family love become entangled. "I can't undo what I did to you," he concluded, "but maybe I can prevent other families from going through what we went through. Maybe I can use my story as a cautionary tale that helps other people make better choices than I did." I read the letter 3 times before showing it to Em and Jasper, both of whom had become protective of me in ways that were touching and occasionally frustrating. "What do you think?" I asked them. "I think people can change," Jasper said carefully, "but I also think you shouldn't feel obligated to facilitate that change if it's too painful for you." Em was more direct. "He put you through hell, and Ollie, if you want to forgive him, that's your choice, but don't feel like you have to just because he's figured out how to use therapy speak." They were both right, and they were both missing something essential. Derek's crimes against me had been real and devastating, but they'd also inadvertently launched me into the most meaningful work of my life. His betrayal had broken our family, but it had also connected me to thousands of other families and helped create lasting change that would protect vulnerable people for generations. That didn't excuse what he'd done or obligate me to forgive him, but it did suggest that healing could take forms more complex than simple forgiveness or permanent estrangement. I wrote back to Derek, agreeing to meet with him when he was released, but setting clear boundaries about what that relationship might look like. I couldn't pretend that we were a normal mother and son anymore, but I was willing to explore what we might become instead. 6 months later, Derek and I sat in the visiting room of the Portland halfway house where he was completing his sentence. He looked healthier than he had in federal prison, but older too, as if the experience had aged him in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. "I've been following your work," he said. "The advocacy, the speaking engagements, the legislation. I'm proud of who you've become, even though I'm ashamed of what it took to get you there. Derek, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this work because of what you did to me. I'm doing it despite what you did to me. Your actions gave me a platform, but my values gave me a purpose. I understand that, and I want you to know that I'm not trying to insert myself into your advocacy work or claim any credit for your success. I just want to find a way to make amends that goes beyond apologizing." We talked for 2 hours about his plans for the future, his understanding of what had gone wrong in his thinking, and his hopes for eventually rebuilding some kind of relationship with me. It wasn't the reunion of a loving mother and reformed son. Too much damage had been done for that kind of simple narrative. But it was a beginning, a tentative exploration of whether two people who'd shared a family could find a way to share a future. As I drove home from Portland that day, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. Derek's attempt to steal my independence had instead given me a national platform. His crimes had caused our family its innocence, but had gained us both a deeper understanding of what really mattered. I would never be grateful for what Derek had put me through, but I could acknowledge that it had led to outcomes neither of us could have imagined. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us create opportunities for the best things we might become. That evening, I sat in my garden as the late summer light faded over the Oregon hills. The tomatoes were heavy on their vines, the roses were blooming for the second time that season, and Em was inside preparing dinner while video chatting with a family in Texas who needed help fighting a guardianship petition. Grana Revenge 76 now had over 2 million followers, and our advocacy had expanded far beyond social media into legislative reform, legal aid, and direct support for families in crisis. I spoke regularly at conferences, consulted with lawmakers on elder rights legislation, and maintained correspondence with advocates around the world who were adapting our strategies to their own contexts. But sitting in my garden that evening, surrounded by the flowers Henry and I had planted together and the vegetables that would feed me through another winter, I felt most proud of the simplest accomplishment. I was still here, in my own house, living my own life, making my own decisions. Derek's guardianship petition had been designed to erase my autonomy and reduce me to a problem to be managed. Instead, it had amplified my voice and transformed me into someone who helped others find their own voices. He tried to silence me, and had instead helped me become louder than I'd ever imagined possible. Jasper joined me in the garden as the first stars appeared, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and wearing the contented expression of a man who'd found unexpected love in the later chapters of his life. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "I was thinking about how much has changed," I said, "and how much has stayed the same, and I'm grateful for both. For the changes that pushed me to grow, and for the constants that kept me grounded." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over the garden we now tended together. Inside the house, Em was still on her video call, helping another family fight for their grandmother's rights. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more advocacy work, more opportunities to help people find their voices in a world that too often tried to silence them. But tonight, I was simply Oli Cap-Medj, 77 years old, sitting in her garden, with someone she loved, grateful for the unexpected turns that had led her to discover who she really was and what she was truly capable of becoming. The roses Henry and I had planted 20 years earlier were blooming beside new varieties Jasper, and I'd added this spring. The old and the new growing together, roots intertwined, each season bringing fresh possibilities while honouring what had come before. It was, I thought, a perfect metaphor for a life well lived and a future still unfolding. 3 years later, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. Derek, now out of prison and working as a counsellor for families dealing with financial stress and elder care decisions, had been asked to speak at a conference on preventing elder abuse. He wanted to know if I would be willing to appear on the same panel, not as mother and son, but as to people with different perspectives on the same tragic mistake. I accepted, curious to see how we would navigate this public exploration of our private pain. The conference was in Seattle, and Em accompanied me as she did for most of my speaking engagements. She'd become an expert advocate in her own right, running a nonprofit that used social media to fight guardianship abuse, and helping families across the country tell their stories effectively. Derek's presentation was honest and unflinching in its examination of how financial pressure had corrupted his judgment and led him to rationalize unconscionable actions. He spoke about the warning signs families should watch for, the resources available to prevent financial elder abuse, and the importance of having honest conversations about money and care before crisis situations developed. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about the experience of being victimized by someone you love and trust, about the unique trauma of family betrayal, and about the possibility of healing without forgiveness. Derek and I will never have the relationship we had before his guardianship petition. I said to the audience of social workers, lawyers, and family advocates, that relationship was based partly on my illusion that my son was incapable of betraying me, his illusion that his love for me would prevent him from doing anything harmful. But we're building a new relationship based on truth instead of illusion. It's more limited, more careful, but also more honest. We both know exactly who the other person is now, including their capacity for both harm and growth. During the Q&A session, someone asked whether I regretted the public nature of our family's crisis. No, I said without hesitation. Making our story public saved my independence and helped thousands of other families. Privacy would have protected Derek's reputation, but left me powerless and isolated. When family members use legal systems to abuse elderly relatives, privacy becomes complicity. After the conference, Derek and I had coffee together, something that had become an annual tradition, marking the anniversary of his release and our tentative reconciliation. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't filed that petition? He asked. Every day, I admitted. I probably would have lived quietly in my house, writing my little stories and tending my garden, completely unaware of how many people were suffering in silence. Do you think you would have been happier? I considered the question carefully. I would have been more comfortable. But I don't think I would have been happier. Helping people find their voices has given my life a meaning I never expected to discover at my age. I'm glad something good came from my terrible choices. Derek, good things came from my choices in response to your terrible choices. That's an important distinction. As I flew home to Oregon that evening, I thought about The strange alchemy that had transformed our family's worst crisis into the most meaningful work of my life. Grana Revenge 7/6 had evolved from a desperate attempt to save my house into a global movement that had changed laws, saved families, and given voice to people who had been systematically silenced. The house where it all began was now both a private home and an informal headquarters for elder rights advocacy. Em had moved into her own apartment in Portland, but still came for Sunday dinners and strategy sessions. Jasper spent most evenings with me, tending the garden that had become a symbol of persistence and growth despite attempts to uproot everything we'd built. My writing had evolved too. Instead of short stories for literary magazines, I was working on a book about the intersection of aging, technology, and social justice. Publishers were interested not just in my personal story, but in the broader lessons about how ordinary people could use digital tools to fight institutional injustice. "What's the title going to be?" Em asked during one of our Sunday dinners. "I'm thinking Revenge of the Grannies, How Social Media Saved My Life and Changed the Law," I said. Jasper laughed. "Subtle. At my age, subtlety is overrated. If you have something important to say, you might as well say it clearly." As I finished writing this account of our journey, I realized that the story's real climax wasn't Derek's arrest or my congressional testimony or even the passage of federal legislation. It was the gradual recognition that I had agency in my own life, that I could choose how to respond to betrayal and trauma, and that those choices could ripple outward to affect thousands of other lives Derek had tried to make me a victim of. His ambition. Instead, I had chosen to become an advocate for everyone facing similar attacks on their autonomy and dignity. That choice had transformed not just my own life, but the lives of countless people who had found their voices through our example. The irony was not lost on me that my son's attempt to silence me had instead amplified my voice beyond anything I could have imagined. He had intended to erase my independence and had instead helped me discover the full extent of my power. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up teaching us exactly how strong we really are. And sometimes that strength becomes a gift we can share with others who are fighting their own battles against those who would silence them. As I sat in Henry's reading chair that evening, looking out at the garden where this story began, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led me to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of becoming. I was Oli Capmej, 77 years old, mother of a son who had betrayed me, survivor of elder abuse, accidental social media star, federal legislation influencer, and advocate for anyone who refused to be silenced by age, family, or circumstance. I was also someone who still baked bread on Sunday mornings, still grew tomatoes that Henry would have been proud of, and still believed that the best stories were the ones where ordinary people discovered they were more extraordinary than they'd ever dared to imagine. The roses were blooming again, just as they had the morning Derek's petition arrived in my mailbox. But I was no longer the same woman who would open that envelope with trembling hands. I was someone who had learned that when people try to steal your voice, the most powerful response is to use it louder than you ever have before. And I was someone who intended to keep using that voice for as long as I had breath to speak and stories to tell. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.